All right, hi guys. We are going to continue with Chapter 6 from Lincoln, How Abraham Lincoln Ended Slavery in America by Harold Holzer. Chapter 6. The Mystic Chords of Memory. For the most part, the Lincoln family greatly enjoyed their journey to Washington, D.C. 16-year-old Robert may have had the best time of all. He sang songs all along the train ride as his father's friend Ward Lamon strummed his banjo. From time to time, Bob also drank too much wine and paid too much attention to pretty girls. In Indianapolis, he somehow lost track of the only existing copy of the inaugural address, which his father had given to him to safeguard. Infuriated, Lincoln gave Bob a public tongue lashing and then leapt over the hotel check-in counter and tore through dozens of grip sacks before finally finding it. The so-called Prince of Rails shrugged off the incident. As he put it, the old man might as well scold about that as something else. The two were never as close as the president had become to his younger boys, William Wallace, known as Willie, and Thomas, nicknamed Tad. William and Tad certainly created much mischief of their own along the way. They made faces at startled passers-by from train windows and scampered around each new town as their mother struggled vainly to keep the excited boys under control. Mary was the guest of honor at dozens of ladies' receptions and proudly joined her husband in carriage processions and at special dinners. While in Columbus, Ohio, Lincoln received word of his official election as President of the United States. The electoral votes had finally been counted in Washington amidst real fears that Southerners would try to disrupt the process. Army General Winfield Scott had even transported cannon to Capitol Hill, to remind Southerners he would use force to see that the vote counting went on as scheduled. It did. Guys, here are some pictures. Here, this one, it says the Lincoln's firstborn son, Robert Todd Lincoln, as he looked as a young law student at Harvard. Okay, and then over there, you can see that it says the mischievous Lincoln boys who lived in the White House. William Wallace, Willie, is on the left, Thomas, Tad at the right, with their cousin Lockwood Todd. Willie died in 1862 at age 11. People didn't live as long back then as they do now. Okay. So did Lincoln's trip. Wherever he went in what he called his meandering journey, crowds gathered to see and hear him. Through Indiana and Ohio he traveled, then after a brief stop in Pennsylvania, headed to western New York State. In the tiny village of Westfield, New York, the Lincoln train stopped briefly to take on fuel and water, giving Lincoln the chance to call to the crowd for a little girl named Grace Bedell. The 11-year-old girl had written a letter to Lincoln during the campaign suggesting that he grow a beard. Grace thought his face looked entirely too thin and believed she could get her father and brothers to vote for him if he would just grow whiskers to make himself better looking. Lincoln had written a now famous reply saying it would be so silly to grow a beard so late in life, but shortly after winning the election, he began doing so anyway. Now he wore the thick whiskers for which he became famous. Perhaps he thought it might prove too difficult to shave every day during his train journey to Washington. Or maybe he took Grace's advice after all. In Westfield, he picked her up in his arms in front of the local crowd, planted several hearty kisses on her face, and thanked her for her inspiration. Grace was so embarrassed by the attention that she ran away and could not be found until the Lincoln train had long gone. But she felt better soon enough and spent the rest of what proved to be a very long life telling the story of how it was she who suggested that Abraham Lincoln grow a beard. But not everything about the inaugural journey proved heartwarming. In New York City, where Lincoln had spoken so brilliantly at Cooper Union just 1 year earlier, crowds now seemed hostile. Probably because for the first time they included Democrats. What was worse, the Democrat who served as mayor let it be known that he thought New York should secede too and set up a kind of independent city. Mayor Ferdinando Wood's goal was to continue shipping goods in and out of the slave states, even if war broke out and interrupted trade between North and South. New York was the nation's largest port, and boats often brought loads of cotton there. It did not seem to bother Wood, or many other New Yorkers, that the cotton had been planted and picked by enslaved people. The sad fact was that New York and other northern cities had long profited from the slave labor in this way. Profited means they made money from it. Even though they weren't doing it, their businesses somehow made money from it, profited. They were extremely reluctant to lose Southern businesses. Lincoln soon put a stop to talk of New York secession. He simply drawled that he could not believe the nation's front door could set up housekeeping on its own. Lincoln's inaugural trip was scheduled to take him through just one slaveholding city before he reached Washington, Baltimore, Maryland. The day before he was scheduled to appear there, however, the president-elect learned that pro-slavery terrorists planned to murder him when he changed trains to board the line heading south for the capital on the final leg of his long journey. His alarmed friends quickly convinced him to cancel his appearance and make new arrangements to sneak through town in the dead of night. With reluctance, Lincoln agreed to the secret plan and even wore a small hat and shawl on the journey so people would be less likely to recognize him. Lincoln passed safely through Baltimore, but suffered much ridicule for doing so. Opponents branded him a coward. One newspaper scoffed that America's next president had crept into Washington like a thief in the night. It took days before Lincoln convinced people in Washington that he was serious and ready for business. On this last page, here's another portrait of Lincoln, so you get an idea of what he looked like with the beard that the little girl suggested. Lincoln faced another crisis before taking the oath of office as president. For weeks, a group of older leaders from a number of states, South as well as North, had been meeting at Washington's Willard Hotel to find a way to get the 7 Confederate states to abandon secession and return to the Union. They called their meeting the Peace Convention, and the delegates made no secret of their belief that almost any compromise would be acceptable as long as it prevented separation and violence. One of their proposals was to allow slavery to expand all the way to the Pacific Ocean, as long as it did so only in southwestern areas like Arizona and Southern California. Of course, Lincoln hated this idea. Anything that allowed slavery to spread, he had long vowed to fight. The Peace Convention presented a real test for the little-known president-elect. The delegates were more experienced than he was and thought they knew better how to reverse secession and to save the Union. To meet his latest challenge to his authority, Lincoln booked a suite for himself at the same hotel, invited all the delegates to his room, and greeted them personally. Many were amazed that he recognized so many of them or knew their names. He impressed all of them, even some of the Southerners, with his dignity and strength of purpose. This was not the bore or clown they had heard about. He was courteous and kindly. But whenever a Southern delegate ventured a rude comment, he responded strongly, with a ring to his voice and a flash from his eyes. And he certainly made it clear that he would not welcome a plan that allowed slavery to widen its evil presence in the country.